Welcome everybody to beautiful Balcarry Bay here in Dumfries and Galloway, and I'm so pleased to be here as part of the Festival of Folklore to tell you one of my favourite stories from the local area. Now, I first read the story of the Mermaid of Barnhourie in this book here, Tales of Galloway, which was written by local author Alan Temperley. And before I start, I want to say a huge thank you to Alan for giving me permission to retell this story in my own way. Now, are you sitting comfortably? If not, don't worry, you can always press pause, sit yourself in your most comfortable chair, wrap yourself in a cosy blanket, and then press play as soon as you're ready. Okay, let's begin. Now, our story begins on a cool, clear April evening and on board a small lugger that was making its way from Whitehaven down the mouth of the River Ure. The moon was high in the sky and the light shone down and highlighted the dark curls on a sailor's head. Now, that sailor was busy working on board the ship, but he stopped suddenly because as he looked out, he thought he saw the head of a seal, and so he whistled for its attention. Nothing, so he whistled once more. Still nothing. But he did get the attention of the ship's captain, who told him, "You should know better than to whistle on board a ship, especially when we're so close to the banks of the river." And so the sailor turned away and carried on with his work. Now, you might have realised at home that it wasn't, in fact, the head of a seal that the sailor saw, but that of a mermaid. Now, I love mermaids, and I particularly love this mermaid. And in many stories about mermaids, we see them sitting on rocks, just like this one, out at sea, singing. And when they sing, the moon turns blood red. And they sing towards passing ships, and the sailors fall in love with the sound of the mermaids' voices. And the mermaids watch as the sailors slowly bring the ships until they crash into the rocks and drown. Our mermaid was not like those mermaids. Our mermaid was deeply in love with the sailor on board that small lugger. In fact, she was so in love with him that she would follow the ship every time it went out of the port and whenever it came back in. And on this cool, clear April evening, she swam parallel to the ship. And she watched as the sailor gathered his belongings together, jumped over the ship and began his 5-mile walk back home to Dalbeattie. But this is where this tale gets a little bit sad, because our poor mermaid was heartbroken. For waiting at home in Dalbeattie was the sailor's wife and 2 children. And to nurse her heartbreak, the mermaid swam to her favourite point at Needles Point, which is just up the coast, just up from where I'm sitting right now. And she would sit and rock in the gentle waves, comforting herself. Now, the following morning, not being able to help herself, the mermaid swam back to where the lugger was and watched as the sailor worked with a pot of pitch. And nearby his children were playing, and she watched them curiously for a time. And what she hadn't realised was that whilst she was watching the sailor's children, the sailor had spotted her. And as soon as the mermaid realised this, she turned and she swam as far away as quickly as she could. But something stopped her, and she turned and swam back. And she climbed up the rigging of a nearby ship, poking her head up out of the surface of the water, and watched the sailor as he leaned over the side of the lugger, casting his eyes over the surface of the water to see if he could see the mermaid once again. But she'd gone. And soon his children came back and distracted him, and he was gone again. Now, later that week, the lugger was ready to set sail once again, and the mermaid watched as it pulled its way down the River Ure and out back round to Whitehaven. It was gone 3 months this time, And during that time, there were so many terrible storms out at sea. So bad were they that the banks of the river itself had started to shift and move. And at the end of the 3 months, when the lugger was starting to make its way back home, there was another terrible storm. And the captain steered the ship as best he could. Over the waves the ship rose and sank. But the captain didn't know that the banks of the river had shifted, and he crashed. And our sailor held on as much as he could, but he was pulled into the water and turned over and over again, and he cried out, "Help! Somebody help me!" But the wind was so fierce that his cries were lost. But not before they'd reached the ears of the mermaid, who, on hearing the sailor's cries, swam as quickly as she could to find the wreckage of the ship. And she spotted the sailor, and she scooped her arms underneath his, and she pulled him up over the rocks and into a nearby cave, where she waited with him for the rest of the evening. The following morning, the sailor awoke and looked at the mermaid who'd saved his life, the same mermaid he'd seen 3 months earlier. And he watched her as she slithered back off the rocks and into the sea. He couldn't believe his eyes as he watched her splashing about in the ocean. And he shook himself and he made his way out of the cave to see what he could find at the wreckage of the nearby ship. But the sailor couldn't get the mermaid out of his head after that. And for the rest of the summer, he would go and visit the mermaid again and again. Sometimes they would swim together in the sea, even though he wasn't the strongest swimmer, and she'd laugh at him. And then sometimes he would lift her up in his strong arms and take her to the banks of the river. And they spent many, many happy hours as they fell deeper and deeper in love with each other. And so in love had the sailor fallen with the mermaid that he'd forgotten about his poor wife and 2 children, who were now getting to be quite raggedy and hungry, waiting at home in Dalbeattie. And so the sailor had no choice but to go back out once again at sea. And so in September, he packed up his things, he said goodbye to the mermaid, and he left on a ship to the Whitehaven, where another ship was waiting to take him to the Americas. 7 months later, and our mermaid gave birth to a baby. And that baby was beautiful. He had dark curly hair like his father and a long silver tail like his mother. And from the first day on this earth, that baby could swim in the sea like a fish. 20 months in total, he was gone in the Americas, until finally he was able to return home. He'd done some good trading around the islands of the West Indies, and it was time to come back to his home in Galloway, to his mermaid love. Now on the journey back, an illness broke out amongst the crew on the ship, and many of them perished, including the captain himself. And so the ship had to stop and take on new crewmen who didn't know the coastline round the Solway coast, as well as the other shipmates, but they did the best that they could. And just as the sailors were starting to get excited, as they looked over the port side and saw the hills of Galloway there in the distance, they were almost home, they could feel it. The new ship's mate crashed the ship into an outcrop of rocks because he didn't know the coastline that well. And once again, our sailor hung on as hard as he could for as long as he could. But like the other sailors, he was pulled into the ocean as the ship began to fill more and more with water until finally it was sunk. But once again, his cries reached the ears of the mermaid, who made sure that the baby was safe before swimming off to try and see if she could find the wreckage and find her love. It was a long swim. It took almost 2 hours until finally she came across the wreckage of the ship, and there were bodies of other sailors in the water, and she moved them to one side as she desperately tried to find the sailor. She was at it for hours and hours she searched, but she couldn't find him. And she had to accept that the sailor was dead. And so she returned to Barnhourie. And she cried, holding her baby tight all night. The following morning, she noticed to the side of the bank a mound of what looked like seaweed, and so she went closer. And as she got close, she realised that it wasn't all seaweed at all, but it was her sailor, just as young, just as handsome as he'd ever been, but he wasn't conscious and he wasn't breathing. And so she moved as quickly as she could, and she found plants and herbs, and she crushed them together, and she cried the saltless tears of a mermaid into a paste, and she pressed that paste into the lips of the sailor, and then she moved him into the water, and she waited. Life came back into the sailor then, and although he wasn't quite human, he could now breathe under the water and swim better than he ever could. And he could be with his mermaid love. And for many years they were happy living in the sea together, and they had many, many more children. And all the children had dark curly hair like their father and long silver tails like their mother. And you might be thinking at this point, you might have already thought about it before now, what about the poor sailor's wife and children? Well, when they thought that the sailor had been lost at sea, the people on the ship made sure that the wife and children were well cared for. And a couple of years after, the wife met somebody new and remarried. And so, our story had a happy ending. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is the story of the Mermaid of Barnhourie. Thank you so much. Goodbye.